Thank you, Oliver. I'm going to find somewhere to put this water. So I have the unenviable task of talking about PRRS diagnostics. And if you think this is primarily a PRRS diagnostic conversation, it's not. So although it's bolded there, please highlight the practical application. That's really my strength, not the diagnostics side of it. So we're going to talk more about how to practically apply them in the real world. But before I get started, I wanted to talk about my experience in the US. So obviously, I'm going to come to you today with a US experience. I've got some experience in Asia, a little bit in South America, and very limited experience in the European market. So take that for what it's worth. I'll bring to you, I hope today, a couple take-homes that you can take home and use in order to really bring a current status into your practical lives. But I don't intend to give you a recipe. I don't anticipate that you're going to be able to follow the US recipe for things. I don't generally like recipes. I like to go off the cuff and do what needs to be done for the herd that I'm working with at the time. So I hope you take that into context. So as we get started, why a roadmap? Why did I pick a roadmap? Well, I think the current status itself lends to the roadmap concept. So the current status, finding the current status of a herd, is really the starting point. If we don't have that well defined, we don't know where we're heading. And so even if we have a really good plan in place and we have really good implementation of a plan, if we don't start where we thought we started, we don't end up in the right place. So the current status is really important, so starting in the right spot. And then the other part about a roadmap is that it's got many routes. And so your goals, as Oliver went through today, may be control, maybe elimination, may be different for you than for someone down the road. But there may be different routes to get to that goal, even if the goal is the same. So a map is more informative to figure out where am I and where am I going versus a plan or a recipe to get there. So I thought a roadmap was applicable. So there are 4 parts to my talk today. I will talk about diagnostics, but really just to walk through the basics to make sure we're all on the same page. Secondly, I'll talk about defining the herd status. I think that's really important. We'll talk a little bit about the application considerations that we need to have in herds. And then finally, we'll get to that practical application. So the diagnostic tools. So first of all, we have to have a baseline of understanding. And again, I'm coming from this US perspective. So let's try to understand the tools that we have in our toolbox. In the United States, we think we have great tests. I didn't say they were perfect, just that they were great, right? And so honestly, we use 2 tests, and that's it. We just use the IDEX ELISA and the PRRS PCR. And so our IDEX ELISA is our antibody detection test. We use that to measure exposure. And our PRRS PCR is our antigen detection test, and we use that as a proxy for shedding. So PRRS viral shedding, okay? So I'm going to briefly walk through these 2 tests just to make sure we're all on the same page. So the PRRS ELISA, we run it on serum and oral fluids in the United States, and our results are reported as an S/P ratio. And I have this gorgeous little diagram I got off the IDEX website to kind of walk me through how an indirect ELISA works. The important part about this is to remember that the positives are 0.4 or above, and negatives are below 0.4. A positive means that antibodies are present. So those nucleocapsid antibodies that Mike talked about, they're there, they're in the sample. A negative means that they don't currently have detectable levels of antibody. And then to get back to that S to P ratio. So what is that? What does that really mean to us? So it comes back in a number from the lab. It's the sample optical density to the positive optical density. And what that means is how blue did your sample turn, so on this top line here, how blue did your sample turn compared to the control? And so that's all it's really comparing. It's how blue is blue. So more blue means it's a bigger number, and less blue means it's a smaller number. So when you're looking at the differences in those numbers, that's all you're looking at, is the color change there. And so I just want to make sure that that's clear. So as we're interpreting our positive results, or how blue is our sample, our antibodies may be present for many reasons. So we can have current or previous infection, historical infection. We can have vaccination, whether that's from a modified live vaccine or from a killed vaccine. And we can have transfer of maternal antibodies from sows, and those are typically in younger piglets, up to about 4 weeks. And it's also fair to note that we can have some false positive reactions on the ELISA test. So in the United States, we recognize that is 1 to 2 per 100 samples. And so oftentimes when we get those false positive tests or the anticipated false positive tests, then we go back and we would run and go do further testing, either additional ELISAs, additional sample, or an IFA. So that's our ELISA test, and that's how we measure exposure. So now we move on to the PRRS PCR test. So in the US, we run PCR on almost anything. So we run it on serum a lot. We do some blood swabs, which is something we talked about yesterday. Certainly blood swabs are more common in younger piglets and in boars. We do run PRRS PCRs on tissues, typically out in finishing pigs. We do oral fluids on a very regular basis in grow finish. Tonsil swabs or scrapings, especially if we're looking for latent infections. We can run it on semen, although that's fallen by the wayside. And we do run it quite a bit on environmental swabs. And so with that, I'm talking about swabbing trailers or swabbing floors in farrowing rooms or nurseries, swabbing equipment, swabbing hands, those kinds of things to understand where PRRS is and how is it moving and how are we acting as fomites in that process. So those are all the different sample types we use for PRRS PCR. So PRRS PCR detects RNA of actual viral particles in the sample. So a positive means that there's detectable levels of RNA in the sample, not live virus, but detectable levels of RNA in the sample. And a negative means that there's not detectable RNA in the sample. So positive results in that case are really easy to interpret. If we have positive PCRs, then there's probably virus around. Whether it's alive or not is another question, but it's probably alive, it's probably around, and it's likely that animals have been shedding the virus if the virus is around. Negatives, on the other hand, are much more complex. So PCR negatives can be because it's simply not there. There's a lack of presence of the virus. It could be that we had inappropriate sample handling and we have just destroyed the RNA in the sample and we can't get the PCR to run. It could be that there's a really low amount present, and so therefore with the cycle times that we call our thresholds, either 38 in some labs, 40 in others, it doesn't meet that amount, so it comes back as a negative. When it's not truly negative, it's simply a very low amount of virus present. It could also be some inhibition in the test, so just some characteristics of some of our sample types that would allow us to not allow the PCR to run well. And it could be some other inherent test problems. So if, for instance, years ago, a new PRRS virus came through the United States, and we had a little bit of trouble detecting that virus in samples on a regular basis, and we found that fairly quickly, and we're able to add new primers to the test so that all the labs would be able to detect the virus. So that's a primer issue. Other things could be extraction methods, especially for some of these new sample types. All those things would give us negative results, and those are most concerning. So again, just to go back, our ELISA tests help us understand exposure, whereas the PRRS PCR tests help us understand shedding, or a proxy for shedding. So as we move on, now we can move into defining a herd status. And I subtitled this, Creating a Common Language. I think it's really important to have a common language as we're talking about things. So as we all look up here, I think we can certainly see that we all know the word hello in many different languages, and we know that that all means the same thing. But as we're talking as practitioners, we talk about the status of sow herds, and we have many different terms that we utilize on a regular basis that may or may not be the same thing. So a negative herd may be a naive herd. It may be a negative but exposed herd. Oh, probably not. We certainly have many different ideas of what the word stable means. So as we kind of walk through this, in the United States, what happened was we had a joint committee, or a joint decision between the American Association of Swine Veterinarians and the USDA, and they developed a 12-member panel. They came from private industry, or private practice industry, and they had representation from our National Pork Board as well as the swine vets. They came together in order to define what these things should mean. And it really came out of the impetus that we couldn't make sense out of what we were talking about. As practitioners, we'd have an anecdotal story for 1 or 2 herds, and we would say, that really worked there. And somebody down the road said, no, I did that, that didn't work for me. But we really didn't have the same definition as how we were starting. Was it really a stable herd, or wasn't it a stable herd? How clinical? Was it clinical? Was it the same virus? Was it a different virus? And so there was all of this kind of churning that didn't result in any results. And so they thought that if we came up with these definitions, we would have a better starting point, and as an industry, we would move forward. So this was described to me as the first committee meeting. It was kind of chaotic. A lot of fighting amongst ourselves, a lot of discussion and debate and arguing about what these definitions should mean and what people should have to require, how much testing you have to do. And finally, it didn't take too long, but it did take a while. Finally, it came out that the committee kind of backed into what they agreed upon and what they decided to do, and now they had to fight everybody else outside of the committee to try to explain it and make sure that people understood what they had to do. And so certainly progress was made, but it was kind of a painful, ugly process. But what came out of it was that in 2010, a proposal was submitted to the AASV board, and then a subsequent paper was published. And so basically, this paper is the foundation of the PRRS herd statuses in the United States, and that will be what I talk about going forward. And again, they use these classifications, they define these classifications based on exposure and based on shedding. So it takes us back to those diagnostics. So I'm going to walk through the different classes in each of these categories. So with the shedding status, the first category is positive. So if you're positive, so you have PCR positives, you have diagnostic or clinical evidence of viral shedding or transmission in the herd, or you just don't know. If you don't know, you are automatically in this category. It's the default category. So then they added an uncertain category, and no veterinarian likes this. You want to say yes or no, right? But this is uncertain. So in this case, you have diagnostic data that suggests you're negative, but we don't think you have enough. We don't think either because of power calculation, or you haven't tested enough, your sampling strategy is a little different, you're not quite there. You haven't given it enough time to know for sure you're negative, but you're pretty sure you're negative. So you're in this uncertain category. And then finally, you're negative. You have the evidence you need with the absence of viral shedding in a herd. So those are the 3 things that three categories we have with shedding status. Now with exposure status is pretty easy. The PRRS ELISA, you're either positive or you're negative as a herd. So if we either have evidence to support prior exposure to PRRS, or it's default, we're assumed we're PRRS positive, exposure positive, or we have evidence to support that they're ELISA negative, the herd's negative for exposure. Those are much easier. So as you put those different combinations together, you end up with these 5 buckets. You end up with really 4 buckets, but of course we had to have a little definition in the middle. So our first category is PRRS, or is positive unstable, PRRS positive unstable. And so that just means we are shedding and we are exposed. And again, this is our default category. If I walked into a herd today with no history at all whatsoever and I had done no PRRS diagnostics, that's where you're at. You're positive unstable. That's what they say. The next category is positive stable. So they divided this into 2 categories to designate those herds that were stable, meaning that they were uncertain as to whether or not they were still shedding. They were pretty sure they weren't, but they were uncertain, although they had been exposed to the virus, so certainly positive. They define those differently than herds undergoing elimination. And really that was to help other practitioners understand where the different herds were at. So were they putting a plan in place to eliminate, or were they simply maintaining an immune status over a long period of time? And then at the bottom then, as we get into, we're able to prove that we're not shedding. So we are negative shedding, but we still have exposure. We still have some ELISA positive sows in those herds. Those would be our provisional negative herds. And at the bottom, we have our negative herds, so category 4 herds. So this is our breeding herd classification. And the breeding herd classification is regardless as to whether or not you have grow-finished pigs on the site. So this is where breeding herds fit. As we get into the growing pig herds, on growing pig sites, given the US, we tend to have 2 to 3 site herds. Our growing pig herds are very easy to classify. You're either positive or you're not. That's how they're classified today. So any evidence, ELISA positives, PCR positives, those herds are all positive unless they can prove that they're ELISA negative. So we don't do a lot of differentiation as it comes to grow-finished pigs. So this classification, it seems very simple, but what it allowed us to do as practitioners is it allowed us to create systematic management plans for breeding herds. So my husband was on the PRRS task force at the time, and they developed this guideline. And what it was really was it took the different statuses here across the top. They had to make their own twist on it eventually, and they added a long-term stable. So these were the herds that were wanting to maintain this immune status over a long period of time. But they developed a series of tests that they had to require for each one of those different categories to get into the next category. And they put in there the timeline as to how long it would take to get into that category. And this is only the start of the chart. This chart goes all the way down, and it also has management practices that you would put into place, things like cross-fostering piglets and changing needles and those types of things, depending on the category that you were placed into. And so this helped practitioners all understand where are we starting, what are we doing, what should we be doing, what's typical, and what has the AASV presented as guidelines for us to use. Another thing it helped us do was it helped us standardize the herd categories across the multiple area regional control projects. And so at this time, there were several of them out there, and they all had their own scheme for how they were classifying herds, which made it very complex and very difficult. And so Oliver mentioned this project earlier, and they were able to adapt the color scheme here with the different statuses from the previous slides. Now, they wanted to subdivide those people that were unknown. So they felt the unknowns had a different risk. Those people weren't testing, they weren't reporting, they weren't participating. And so they wanted to keep them in their own category, although they are also a 1, and some of these positives are also a 1. And then the other thing you'll note is that there are no stable grow-finish sites. So these nursery finishes, they will always be 0. You can't have a nursery or finisher site and have it called stable. Those don't exist in our classification scheme. But it helped the area regional control projects move forward, and it helped producers in those projects really define where they were at. The last thing it helped us do was it helped us establish a national PRRS incidence study. So, national PRRS incidence study, as well as this, it led into being the swine health monitoring project. And so if you've listened to any PRRS presentation in the United States in the last probably 5 years, you've seen something that looks a lot like this. And so this has allowed practitioners in the US to report herd statuses over time. And what this is the different herd statuses, so what % of herds reporting. In this case, there were 442 herds reported over time. And it allowed us to understand how many of them were 1s, how many of them were the various categories of 2s in here, and 3s and 4s over time. So we could understand as a national breeding herd, how are we doing? How many herds are in which categories? And are we making progress? Again, this is voluntary participation. This is a nationwide project. There's weekly reporting of these herds and quite a few herds. But what it's allowed us to do was take that one anecdote that we had, or 2 or 3 as an individual practitioner, and it's allowed us to aggregate 30 herds this way and 30 herds that way in order to better understand some of those practices, some of those implementation practices. And so, as Mike alluded to earlier, in the case of using live virus vaccine, or using live virus versus using vaccine in a load, close, expose, and the economic analysis, that was all built on being able to classify herds appropriately so that we could enroll them in a study so that we knew exactly where they started so that we can now understand how they performed. So for us, being able to classify herds has helped us all work together as an industry and make progress as an industry. So moving on to application considerations. Making it actually work is where the challenge lies. So as you consider applying and putting together a current status for a sow herd, it's important to understand you have to start with a desired confidence in the herd status. So when you think about confidence, you're thinking the 95 or the 99, and you're thinking about these numbers but how do they relate to what you really are looking for? How do you relate that back to, am I going to take 60 samples, really? And explaining that to the producer. And so when I think about confidence, I think more about what is the cost of being wrong? So what if I say I'm not shedding, but I really am? What is the cost of that, right? So if I was a boar stud and I say I'm not shedding, but I really am, there's a big cost to that, as that semen is going to go downstream to many different herds and break many different herds, and that's going to have an extreme cost. Versus if I'm shedding out of a breeding herd and I'm going to my on-site nursery and those pigs were going to go there one way or another, the cost didn't change that much, so you probably need less confidence in that case than you would at the boar stud. I think it's an important concept to think about. Another consideration is thinking about the diagnostic tests. So what's available to you? Meaning where can you actually get samples and get them submitted on a timely basis and get results back? What's the cost of having that done? What is the ability to actually obtain the samples? So several of the projects we talked about yesterday had to do with sample types and being able to obtain samples in young piglets. Getting those samples can be very tricky. And again, what sample types are available? So what sample types can be used to your best benefit? I had to put on this to think about sample size and to think about herd size. Certainly as veterinarians, we think about that on a regular basis. I think Oliver also mentioned earlier, we need to think about the different populations of animals present on a premise. We can't look at just sows, we can't just look at due to wean pigs. We need to understand the whole population in a holistic approach. And then finally, we need to think about the herd's vaccination plan as we think about the expectation for what our diagnostic results should be. So those are just some things to consider as you try to go implement this out in the field. So now we come down to the practical application with the roadmap. So with the roadmap, I think starting with this prevention chain, or infection chain as we like to call it, gives us an idea of where to begin. So in this case, we've got our gilt source coming in, we have gilt development, our breeding herd, and at this point in time, our breeding herd is got potential vertical transmission of PRRS virus into our farrowing piglets. So we have piglets here. This point right here is weaning, and then this would be wean to finish or nursery finisher on a single site, and then our market outputs. The only problem I have with this slide, and I think it's a big one, is that it lacks the boars, right? So we've got a lot of gilt stuff going on, but we didn't think about the boars on this side. So I add that into the mix. So if we think about this infection chain, how does that have to do with finding the current status? Well, as you go through a roadmap, I think there are different checkpoints that you can stop at in order to understand where you came from and what's potentially ahead of you. So the first checkpoint, I think, is those boars, right? So if we have a positive or a shedding semen source, it's altogether likely that everything downstream is positive, right? If it's coming in positive from the boar stud, there's not a lot of point in spending a whole lot of time and effort and energy much further down the path. And so I think this is a really important checkpoint. Another important checkpoint is the guilt source. Certainly if we're bringing in positive guilts or guilts of an unknown status, that's a challenge as well. Even if we're making them ourselves on site, understanding what their status is as they come into the herd is important. Another important part is if there's guilt development, and they do right before they enter the sow herd, that is a potential, another spot. So in the US, we do quite a bit of that, and I'll get into an example here. Another spot we may be interested in is that vertical transmission place, so those piglets at birth. So do the sows transmit in utero to the piglets, and so are our piglets positive at birth because of that? And so that might be another checkpoint or another spot. Certainly in the US, we all love to talk about due-to-wean piglets and bleeding due-to-wean piglets, so there's a weaning age spot where we would sample. And then if we go back, we might go into the nursery, we might do mid-nursery, we might do end of nursery, there might be some finishing checking, and then certainly there's checking at market. So those are all different points on the infection chain, production chain, where we can follow PRRS virus through its path and understand what came before and what's likely to come after. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk through a breeding herd example, a US breeding herd. So we have farrow to wean herds in almost everywhere, and it's fairly simplistic, so I'm going to start here. So our first checkpoint, again, are those boars. So in the United States, most, if not all, of our boar studs are PRRS negative, and they have a PRRS monitoring plan in place. It's a very rigorous plan. So some of those boar studs would sample, they would either do ear swabs or they would do jugular sticks, and they would do potentially a statistical sample of all the boars at once a week for PCR and ELISA. That would be the low end of the spectrum. All the boars in the stud once a week. The high end of the spectrum is every single boar every time they're collected. And so those samples would go in, they would be sent in that morning when they were collected, they would have those results that afternoon, and the sow farms would have the results to make sure that those boars are negative the following morning. It's a fairly rigorous process. But again, as I said, the pain of being wrong with the boar stud is very challenging in the US. So that's a heavy checkpoint in our system. Another spot we always check is our gilts at entry. So verifying that gilts coming in are the status we believe they are. Typically there's a long-standing history from the source herd. I'm certain you have that in Europe as well. But sometimes we would check them the one time prior to entry, verify they didn't get exposed to PRRS in transport, verify they came in exactly as I expected. And then typically there might be either an isolation period where we would check them on the way out to verify that again, or this is potentially an acclimation period. So where we would vaccinate those animals and verify that they are no longer shedding virus, whether it's vaccine virus, or in the cases of some of the practitioners using live virus still, verifying that they are not shedding PRRS at this checkpoint. So this checkpoint becomes very important, particularly in acclimated herds. The next checkpoint we typically would have is the due-to-wean pigs. So if we're sending all of these pigs off-site to grow finish sites or wean finish sites, we want to verify what kind of pigs we're sending in order to maintain our current status or to understand our current status according to what we had shown with the AASV statuses before. And so this checkpoint in the US is typically 30 due-to-wean piglets once a month. That's the minimum. Depending on where you're at and whether or not you would like to get to a different status, you might do 60, there might be more. Just depends. And then the last one is here at birth. So we have some practitioners that are using this to understand as a herd is trying to go negative, as a herd is closed and is trying to go negative, do we still have in utero transmission, or has intrauterine transmission stopped so that now all of the transmission and the reason we're having due-to-wean pigs is all in the farrowing house? So that way we can put in different practices in place. So is it because we need to maintain closure and something's not going right and we still have transmission in the breeding herd? Or is it because there are practices going on in the farrowing house, so moving piglets, not changing needles, not changing gloves, not all in, all out by room, those kinds of things? Are there practices in the farrowing house that are allowing PRRS to circulate and circulate and circulate? So that's really the checkpoint there that's helping us with better management of our PRRS positive herds in order to get them to stop shedding. In those cases when we do those piglets at birth, some are doing, it's not necessarily at birth, it's more at processing. So in the United States, we still dock tails. And so we would take a tail swab of that blood and submit those. In some cases, they're using placental umbilical cord samples. So we talked a little bit about umbilical samples yesterday, but what we would not take it off of the piglet, but we would take it off of the placenta itself. And so just weeding through a large placenta and trying to find 4, 5, 6 cords in order to milk them into a tube and send that in as a sample. In some cases, we've used axillary swabs for stillborn piglets. That's another example. It just depends on what we can get people to do on farm readily. But it's an important checkpoint, particularly for PRRS management. So as I said, that was the US breeding herd. It's farrow to wean. It's fairly simple. So if we add a farrow to finish herd, so now we make it a one-site herd, we still have all of those different checkpoints that are potential, but now we have other checkpoints as we have our wean to market population on the same site. And so if you didn't know anything about that, you might just go to marketing, go to the marketing group and say, well, are they ELISA positive? And certainly we can do that by oral fluids. But there are other options in the middle, so maybe we would test them at nursery exit to verify their status at nursery exit. You might want to test mid-nursery to understand what's going on. It all depending upon your vaccination strategy. If there's finisher movements or movements between finishers, that might also be another point on a farm where you would want to test. But this gets complicated, right? Like, who's going to test all of these different places? It seems too much, right? So I've kind of prioritized this down into where do I think that you need to start. So if you were to walk up to me today and tell me I have a farrow to finish herd and I don't know anything about it, what would I do? I would recommend we have a good long talk about what's going on with a bore stud source, with a semen source. Make sure you know what's going on there to start with. Same with a gilt source. If we're coming in positive, everything downstream is positive. So have those really well understood. And then the next thing I would do, if you really and truly think that those two things are negative, and go to the finishing pigs and verify what statuses they are. If finishing pigs are negative, you're done. That's fantastic. But I'm certain there are very, very few of those herds out there where you don't know that you're negative. So you'll likely find PRRS positives there. So if you do, then what do you do next? Well, let's verify that we know exactly what kind of gilts are walking in the door to the sow herd. Make sure they're not bringing in PRRS, or if they're negative, make sure that they stay that way as they come in. And then let's look at the due to wean piglets. So let's start there and see, well, is this PRRS, if I know I have PRRS out here, is it in here? Or is it all the way back here, right? Because we know sometimes our breeding herds can settle down and not shed, and we can still have virus out in the finishing phase. So we would use this as the next checkpoint. And then at tertiary, as you want to really dig into what's going on, I would either do the end of the nursery or here at birth. So if this came back positive, back it up to here and see, is it coming in utero? Or is it just coming through the farrowing house here? And if this is positive and this is negative, then what's going on in my nursery is the nursery where I really need to focus. And so all of those different steps allow us to, and then I think I have 2 more. Yeah, those are kind of, if that's really what you need to do. Right? These are kind of the last points that I would go check here. But all of those will give you an idea of what's really going on that farm in order to come to a consensus as to what I need to do, what I need to do next. How do I answer the questions about what my constraints are? How do I move forward with solution options and put the right solution options in place? So I said earlier that there's a lot of uncertainty around some of this, and if you would go in the US and you'd sample this breeding herd right here, and you do 30 due-to-wean piglets, in the US, the requirement to prove that you're stable and not shedding is to have that 4 times in a row, so 3 months apart, and all of them have to be negative. And so that's a rigorous plan, and it promotes a lot of uncertainty, and even at that point, we still find that there's still a low level of shedding in some herds. So I think in this case, in determining herd status, I think we have to be comfortable with a little bit of uncertainty. So I'm going to wrap up here with my take-home messages. So first, diagnostics are a tool that we have to put together and we have to use. But herd status has this great degree of uncertainty. We have to accept that these 30 samples or 60 samples today, and they are PCR negative, they may not actually be. Those samples may be negative, but that population may not be negative. Or that batch may be negative, but the next batch may not be negative. And so it's an ongoing and continuous process of putting it all together. There are many considerations when you go into a herd and try to ascertain its current status. And one of those is, what's the cost of being wrong? And so if we go in and we take 15 samples here, or we do this oral fluid sample in 2 pens there, what if I'm wrong in what I'm concluding based on those results? And so I think it's an important thing to think about as we determine a herd status, and then its subsequent solution options. I think these diagnostic checkpoints, I laid them all out. They're not all for everybody. You have to tailor that and pick what is going to work and what you really need to understand for that specific herd. And so those diagnostic checkpoints, although there are a lot of them, I don't think all of them need to be done all of the time. It's really important to pick the ones that are appropriate. And then finally, I think that these statuses or classifications have given us a case definition. So as we talk about sow herds, we know, or we talk about grow-finish herds even, we know what we're talking about. We're all talking about the same thing. And so that way we can make progress as an industry. In the US, I believe it has led to improvements. We've certainly learned quite a few things by being able to aggregate those same level of case statuses back together. So 30 herds like this or 60 herds like that, we can see what their results look like and what the variation among herds looks like. And I think that's really helped us along the way. So I hope this helps you put your starting line in place, that you figure out where we're starting so that we can go down the path toward greater PRRS control. So I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues, Krista Goodall and Dale Polson. So they helped me with this presentation. And so Dale's been mentioned earlier. He is the detail guy. I am the broad brush overview. And then my husband, Jim. So I forced him to look at my slides, and I feel obligated. So thank you.
Thank you, Erin, for a great presentation that I think clarifies a lot of things around how we can better monitor PRRS status on herds. We have time for a couple of questions. Yeah. Marius?
You just said that the boar studs use ear swabs to test for PRRS. Did I understand you correctly? Is it common to use ear swabs for test for PRRS? Because for me this is very new.
Yes. So in boar studs in the U.S., when those boars are ejaculating, we will prick those ears with a needle, the ear veins with a needle, yeah, and do a blood swab of that with that technique, yeah. And then they go into a small 1 ml PBS solution, yeah. and those get sent off. The real important part of that with boar stud sampling in that method is to make sure that the swabs are saturated, because if they're not fully saturated, you have a higher dilution rate, and so you may or may not be able to pick up a low level of virus early in an infection. But yeah, so that's one method, and then some boar studs, depending on how they're set up, they will do either saphenous leg vein bleed, or they will do tail bleeds, actually, while those boars are ejaculating. So it's very common.
And many of those boars are tested every collection, correct?
Yeah. Yeah, so the multiplier herds would test those boars, those really high-end boars, every single collection. Many commercial studs would only test each boar once a week. So they may jump once this week, twice next week, but if they jump twice that week, they only get tested one time. Yeah.
Any more questions? We have time for at least one more. I have one, Erin. You mentioned the checkpoint of due to wean and then the newborn piglet, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday. In your experience with cleanup projects, where's the problem mostly arising? Is it the intrauterine transmission, or maybe something happening in the farrowing house?
Yeah, so I think I find both. So in some cases, the load and the close may not be truly a defined close. Somebody's definition of close, my definition of close is that the gilts walk in the door is closed, I can draw a line around the perimeter, no animals came in, no animals went out. Just piglets, they left. Other definitions are maybe they have an off-site gilt thing that they're concluding that's part of the closure, but it's really not. It's not the same population. We're talking about very different population dynamics. And so in some cases, it's this interuterine going on and on and on that we need to define. But in other cases, yeah, we have this farrowing house management. They're using a processing cart, or they're using something from room to room, or they're still cross-fostering piglets to try to save piglets. In those cases, then yeah, they're promoting more PRRS transmission in those farrowing rooms, and that checking at birth really helps define which part of the process is not working.
Great.
So.
Well, I think with that we'll stop. We have more time for questions later. Thank you, Erin, for your great talk.